This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it is Saturday, so that means it's time for another edition of the History of the Banned and Restricted list. In our last video, we looked at the announcements of 1995 in a single video, and this video also covers an entire year, 1996. There was more activity in 96 than in 95, with 3 announcements that added new cards to the banned and restricted lists, and 1 announcement that created a new format, Legacy. As we will see, this year is up there as one of the worst in terms of decisions Wizards made in banning and restricting cards, as one decision in particular ended up resulting in an even more degenerate metagame. Just a reminder, for this part of the video, we are only talking about 2 Magic formats because that's all there was. These formats were Type 1 and Type 2, respectively what we call Vintage and Standard today. The first announcement made in 1996 came in February, and the same decisions were made in both Standard and Vintage. It banned one card we've talked about before, Mind Twist, and restricted another card we haven't seen yet, and that's Black Vise. Let's briefly revisit Mind Twist. It had been restricted way back in August of 1994, and this had been done because it was the kind of card that led to whoever got to cast it first simply winning the game, because now the opponent had no hand. Wizards didn't like cards that had this big of an effect on the game for so little mana, so they restricted it in the hope that it would make games determined by Mind Twist a little less frequent. However, it was still pretty much a staple in any black deck and was especially problematic in the rack control decks, which were particularly powerful at this time. The complete banning of the card was meant to power down the deck and to make competitive games of Magic more common. Black Vise was also restricted in February of 1996. It had been around since Alpha, but had so far managed to avoid getting restricted. However, after aggro decks proved to be especially potent thanks to Black Vise, it finally got restricted in February of 1996. This card was a great way to punish control decks, who often held lots of cards in hand, and it gave aggro players a ton of damage for only a single 1-mana investment. It was particularly problematic when paired with Armageddon, another widely played card for aggro decks at the time, who sought to get ahead on the board and then nuke all the lands on the table, trapping cards in the opponent's hand. Black Vise had been a fixture in decks at the highest level, putting up a top 8 at Worlds in 94, 4 at Worlds in 95, and 2 at Pro Tour New York in 1996. Wizards finally decided to restrict it because aggro decks were really starting to dominate and crowd control decks out of the metagame, especially in Standard. However, this restriction was arguably one of the biggest mistakes Wizards ever made with a ban and restricted announcement. Why, you ask? Well, the presence of Black Vise had pretty much prevented one particularly powerful card from really flourishing, and that was Necropotence. It had done a little bit at the highest level at this point, but Black Vise absolutely murdered the card since it liked to pay life and draw tons of cards, both things that Black Vise punishes considerably. The restriction of this card led to one of the more degenerate Standard formats we've ever seen, one called Black Summer, because mono-black Necropotence decks were so dominant, there was basically no reason to play anything else. These decks had nothing keeping them in check now, and it made for a very boring year of competitive Magic, because these decks were so degenerate. So yeah, with this restriction, they actually did more damage to the format than anything. In April of 1996, another announcement was made, but it's a little bit different than those we've seen before. It unbanned Time Vault and Vintage, and gave it new errata to try to keep people from abusing it with untap effects. In the end, Wizards decided to reintroduce this card and make the effect it had be what they originally intended. Instead of having an effect that lets you have an extra turn multiple times, they wanted to make sure it would only work once. So, they changed the way this card worked. Time Vault now required a counter on it to be removed to get the extra turn, so simply untapping it with Twiddle and the like no longer worked. This ruling worked, at the time, at keeping Time Vault in check, and it really didn't see much play in its new form, so in the short term, this did work out. In May of 1996, another new format was created. So far, we've had Type 2, what we call Standard, and Type 1, what we call Vintage. Legacy was something in between, so at the time it was called Type 1.5. Legacy was a non-rotating format like Vintage, but the key difference between the two is that Legacy has no restricted list, only a banned list, and any card on the Vintage restricted list was banned in Legacy. This meant that there was no Power 9 and the like. One thing that is particularly odd, especially looking back from today, is that at this point there was a restricted list in Standard, and any cards that were restricted in Standard were completely banned in Legacy too. Anyway, going forward, we're now talking about 3 separate banned and restricted lists, but the Legacy list for a while is pretty much tied to whatever happens in the Standard and Vintage lists. We don't have to go too far to get to the point where we see a card get restricted in Standard and thus it got completely banned in Legacy, because in July of 1996, land tax became the first newly restricted Standard card to get banned in Legacy as a result. So why did land tax find itself in this situation? Well, it was just too powerful, as many cards on this list are. Land tax has an effect that might seem somewhat strange for white, in that it lets you search your library for lands and put them into your hand. However, this ability to search for lands, provided your opponent has more than you do, is still something that white gets on occasion these days, like on Knight of the White Orchid. So, what made land tax so great? Well, for one thing, it wasn't all that hard to make it so you could search your library for 3 lands on every turn, especially if you were on the draw, since your opponent would naturally have one more land than you in most cases. While sure, all you're getting with this effect is lands, you are still creating massive card advantage and simultaneously decreasing your chance of mana screw and mana flood, as fewer lands are left in your deck for you to draw. However, that stuff alone isn't what made land tax such a problem. Starting in 1995, people started to realize how good land tax could be in conjunction with effects that blow up a bunch of lands, especially with Armageddon. The idea was that you could get land tax down early and start searching for lands so that when you cast Armageddon later in the game, you would have a much easier time rebuilding than your opponent. What's more is, even if you hadn't managed to search your library for some lands ahead of the Armageddon, your opponent would have to play land at some point, and thus they would have more lands than you on your turn, and you'd still get to rebuild more easily than your opponent. Decks running the two together were pretty dominant on the Pro scene from 1995 to 1996, putting up 11 Worlds and Pro Tour top 8s out of a possible 24. In other words, almost half of the decks to top 8 at the biggest events in those years ran land tax. So, land tax was restricted in Standard, so that it would be difficult for people to pull off the powerful combination of land tax and Armageddon. Since Standard rotates, land tax eventually left the format, but it remained banned in Legacy all the way until 2012. Since being unbanned there, though, it hasn't put up any top 8s at major events. The last banned and restricted announcement of 1996 came in October, and it restricted 2 cards in Standard, Hymn to Turok and Strip Mine, as well as 1 card in Vintage, Fast Bond. This, of course, means that all 3 of these cards were also banned in Legacy. Let's start with the Standard announcement. In particular, let's look at Hymn to Turok. Hymn to Turok is a very powerful discard spell. For only 2 black mana, it gives you a 2-for-1. What makes it especially powerful is how random the discard is, and in a lot of ways, Hymn to Turok is like a miniature version of Mind Twist. While it wasn't quite as swingy as the Twist, it was often the case that whoever got to cast this first won the game. We mentioned earlier that the restriction of Black Vise had the unintended consequence of making Necropotence decks too good. Well, Hymn to Turok was also a big part of why mono black decks were so powerful and really just dominating the format. Restricting him was meant to try to reel these decks back in, making them a smaller part of the metagame. This did work, at least in part. In the long run, Hymn to Turok has proven to be one of the more powerful discard spells in the game, and it is still regularly played in Legacy and Vintage. The other card restricted in October of 1996 is Strip Mine, a powerful non-basic land that can blow up any land for 0 mana. Obviously, this is a powerful effect that could be used to really punish an opponent who missed land drops. There were also lots of powerful non-basic lands at the time, like Library of Alexandria and Maze of Ith, which this was particularly useful against. Sacrificing your Strip Mine to blow up a land was just a really good idea on a lot of board states. The problem was that since it was a land, every single deck could run it, and that's pretty much what had happened since 1994. After 2 full years of pretty much every deck running 4 copies of Strip Mine and seeing how the card could slow the game down and cause feel-bad moments, they finally pulled the trigger on restricting it in 1996. In 1998, it would be restricted in Vintage for the same reasons, and it remains restricted there in Banned and Legacy until this day. It is still pretty regularly played as a one-of in Vintage decks. The last card in this announcement was Fast Bond, which was restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy. Like the other 2 cards in this announcement, Fast Bond is pretty clearly powerful to us today, since it allows you to play as many lands as you can for the low cost of only paying a life for each one that you play. Paying life is an incredibly low cost for such a powerful effect. Obviously, like Channel, Fast Bond could allow for absurdly fast starts, something that the banned and restricted list had been trying to fix since its inception. Unlike Hymn to Turok and Strip Mine, both of which were restricted as a result of too many decks running them, Fast Bond wasn't actually seeing any play in Vintage. In this case, Wizards seems to have decided to go after Fast Bond preemptively, realizing that it had the potential to be absurd, even though players hadn't really tapped into it yet. Fast Bond has remained restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy since this announcement, and that's probably a good thing for all of us. Well, those are all the banned and restricted announcements for 1996. Next time, we'll be looking at 1997, another year that would see the creation of a new format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of the History of the Banned and Restricted list, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on the series so far, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.